Marie Delphine McCarty was born on March the 19th, 1787, although the dates vary with different sources, to a wealthy family in New Orleans. Her father had brought the family to New Orleans from Ireland around 1730. The McCarty men had military backgrounds, most were landowners, and her father, Louis Barthélemy de McCarty, was knighted as the Chevalier of the Royal and Military Order of St. Louis. Her mother was Marie-Jeanne Lovable, also known as the widow Lecomte, whose marriage to Barthélemy Louis McCarty was her second. By 1794, her family had a 1,344-acre plantation between Bartholomew and Independence, backing up to St. Claude Avenue, and next door to the famously wealthy Count Pierre-Philippe Mandeville de Marigny. Both were prominent members of the New Orleans white Creole community. Delphine's cousin, Augustine de McCarty, was mayor of New Orleans from 1815 to 1820. The widow Lecomte developed a reputation as a legendary hostess. Guests who attended could expect to be entertained until the early morning hours. Some nights included jumping into the canal on their property and stealing the clothes and shoes of the male guests, forcing them to go home in bare feet and nightshirts. Her humor was a delight to her inner circle, and no one was safe from her practical jokes. When Delphine's mother passed away in 1807, her father sought companionship in an untraditional though popular manner. The Chevalier Louis Barthélemy de McCarty had a long-term relationship with a free quadroon, Sophie Musante. In 1815, Sophie gave birth to a daughter, Delphine Aimée McCarty. The child's godparents were Delphine and her brother Louis. Records show that a few of Delphine's close relatives had relationships with women of mixed race. Delphine's uncle, Eugène, had a 54-year-old relationship with a woman of color, Eulalie Mandeville de Marigny. Eulalie was the daughter of an enslaved woman and the Count himself, the next-door neighbor of Delphine's family. Eugene and Eulalie had 7 quadroon children together in what appeared to be a successful union. Eulalie appeared not to have minded, or had no say in the matter, that Eugene also had children with 2 other free women of color, 5 children in fact. New Orleans history tells us of quite a few wealthy Creole men who were practicing their cohabitation with women of color. Delphine's father, uncle, cousins, and associates contributed to the development of biracial free people of color. These women were referred to in the legal system as a concubine. The Creoles called them ménagères or déplacées. Research proves there were quite a few women of mixed race who were in relations and had children with the McCarty patriarchs. Delphine was barely 14 when she married her first husband, the 35-year-old widow Ramon López y Angulo de la Candelaria. Ramon was an officer of the Spanish crown and second in command to the Louisiana governor. Don Ramon had risen to the position of consul general for Spain in Louisiana. He had recently lost his wife on the treacherous and cruel voyage from Spain to Louisiana to step into his appointed position. It seems Ramon wasn't exactly pleased with the crown's appointment. Perhaps he harbored some bitterness and blame regarding the death of his wife. There is record of him saying that they were sent over from Spain at the worst time of the year. Had they postponed their voyage 1 month as he requested, his wife's life could have been spared in a less grueling voyage. On June 11, 1800, Delphine McCarty married Ramon at the St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans. Also in 1804, Delphine and Don Ramon traveled to Spain. During the voyage, Delphine gave birth to a daughter named Marie Borgia Delphine López y Angulo de la Candelaria, nicknamed Boquita. Delphine and her daughter returned to New Orleans afterwards. Accounts of the trips differ. Grace King wrote in 1921 that the trip was Don Ramon's military punishment and that Delphine met the Queen Consort Maria Luisa of Parma, who was impressed by Delphine's beauty. Ramon boarded a ship in Bordeaux to make his way back to his expecting wife. On January 11, 1805, his vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of Havana, and Ramon was killed. Delphine stayed in Havana long enough to bury her husband and have her daughter baptized. She then returned to her home in New Orleans, a young widow and mother, to discover that New Orleans was no longer under Spanish or French rule, but now under American ownership. In June 1808, Delphine married Jean Blanc, a prominent banker, merchant, lawyer and legislator. At the time of the marriage, a house was purchased at 409 Royal Street in New Orleans for the family, which became known later as Villa Blanc. Delphine had 4 more children by Blanc, named Marie-Louise Pauline, Louise-Marie Laure, Marie-Louise Jeanne, and Jean-Pierre Pauline Blanc. Blanc died in 1816. Delphine married her third husband, physician Leonard Louis Nicolas Lalaurie, who was much younger than she, on June 25, 1825. In 1831 she bought property at 1140 Royal Street, which she managed in her own name with little involvement of her husband, and by 1832 had built a 3-story mansion there, complete with attached slave quarters. She lived there with her husband and 2 of her daughters, and maintained a central position in the social circles of New Orleans. The Lalauries, in the style of their social class at the time, maintained several black slaves in slave quarters attached to the Royal Street mansion. Accounts of Delphine Lalaurie's treatment of her slaves between 1831 and 1834 are mixed. Harriet Martineau, writing in 1838 and recounting tales told to her by New Orleans residents during her 1836 visit, claimed Lalaury's slaves were observed to be singularly haggard and wretched. However, in public appearances, Lalaury was seen to be generally polite to black people and solicitous of her slaves' health, and court records of the time showed that Lalaury emancipated two of her own slaves, Jean-Louis in 1819 and De Vince in 1832. Nevertheless, Martineau reported that public rumors about Lalaury's mistreatment of her slaves were sufficiently widespread that a local lawyer was dispatched to Royal Street to remind Lalaury of the laws relevant to the upkeep of slaves. During this visit, the lawyer found no evidence of wrongdoing or mistreatment of slaves by Lalaury. Martineau also recounted other tales of Lalaury's cruelty that were current among New Orleans residents in about 1836. She claimed that subsequent to the visit of the local lawyer, one of Lalaury's neighbors saw one of Lalaury's slaves, a 12-year-old girl named Leah, fall to her death from the roof of the Royal Street mansion while trying to avoid punishment from a whip-wielding Delphine Lalaury. Leah had been brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a snag, causing Delphine to grab a whip and chase her. The body was subsequently buried on the mansion grounds. According to Martineau, this incident led to an investigation of the Lalaurys, in which they were found guilty of illegal cruelty and forced to forfeit 9 slaves. These 9 slaves were then bought back by the Lalaurys through the intermediary of one of their relatives and returned to the Royal Street residences. Similarly, Martineau reported stories that Lalaury kept her cook chained to the kitchen stove and beat her daughters when they attempted to feed the slaves. On April 10, 1834, a fire broke out in the Lalaury residence on Royal Street, starting in the kitchen. When the police and fire marshals got there, they found a 70-year-old woman, the cook, chained to the stove by her ankle. She later confessed to them that she had set the fire as a suicide attempt for fear of punishment, of being taken to the uppermost room, because she said, anyone who'd been taken there never came back. As reported in the New Orleans Bee of April 11, 1834, bystanders responding to the fire attempted to enter the slave quarters to ensure that everyone had been evacuated. Upon being refused the keys by the Lalaurys, the bystanders broke down the doors to the slave quarters and found 7 slaves more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other, and they claimed to have been imprisoned there for some months. One of those who entered the premises was Judge Jean-François Canonge, who subsequently disposed to having found in the Lalaury mansion, among others, a negress wearing an iron collar and an old Negro woman who had received a very deep wound on her head, who was too weak to be able to walk. Canonge claimed that when he questioned Madame Lalaury's husband about the slaves, he was told in an insolent manner that
some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business.
A version of this story circulating in 1836, recounted by Martineau, added that the slaves were emaciated, showed signs of being flayed with a whip, were bound in restrictive postures, and wore spiked iron collars which kept their heads in static positions. When the discovery of the tortured slaves became widely known, a mob of local citizens attacked the Lalaurie residence and demolished and destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands. A sheriff and his officers had to attend to disperse the crowd, and by the time the mob left, the Royal Street property had sustained major damage, with scarcely anything remaining but the walls. The tortured slaves were taken to a local jail where they were available for public viewing. The New Orleans Bee reported that by April the 12th up to 4,000 people had attended to view the tortured slaves, to convince themselves of their sufferings. The New Orleans Advertiser, writing several weeks after the evacuation of Lalaurie's slave quarters, claimed that 2 of the slaves found in the Lalaurie mansion had died since their rescue, and added, "We understand that in digging the yard, bodies have been disinterred, and the condemned well in the grounds of the mansion having been uncovered, others, particularly that of a child, were found." The child was probably Leah. Madame Delphine Lalaurie did have one loyal servant on her staff, this we know for sure. Amid the mayhem and flames, her enslaved coachman brought her carriage around, and Delphine stepped into it with complete confidence. The mob was stunned, initially, and then the angry citizens tried desperately to hold the horses and snatch her from the carriage. The coachman used his whip and plunged the horses forward, escaping the enraged crowd. He drove the escape route and delivered her to a schooner waiting at the docks of the New Orleans Navigation Company on Lake Pontchartrain, where she boarded and fled. When the coachman arrived back, the determined crowd met the carriage and began to destroy the carriage and stab the poor horses to death. The American poet William Cullen Bryant wrote that he set sail for France out of New York on June the 24th, 1834. His observation of one of his fellow passengers is recorded. "A pretty-looking Frenchwoman, a Madame Lalaurie. She had made her escape, and a close one at that." Delphine and Louis eventually ended up in Paris, with Delphine's children coming over for extended stays. Louis lived off Delphine's wealth, but grew tired of her complaining and left her in Paris as he made his way to Havana. Shortly after, more of Delphine's family moved to Paris, where they all occupied homes in the first arrondissement. Subsequent to Lalaurie's departure from America, the house remained ruined at least until 1836. When Martineau visited the Royal Street mansion that very year, it was still unoccupied and badly damaged, with gaping windows and empty walls. At some point prior to 1888 it was unrecognizably restored, and over the following decades was used as a public high school, a conservatory of music, a tenement, a refuge for young delinquents, a bar, a furniture store, and a luxury apartment building. The circumstances of Delphine Lalaurie's death are unclear. George Washington Cable recounted in 1888 a then popular but unsubstantiated story that Lalaurie had died in France in a boar hunting accident. Delphine McCarty Lalaurie died in Paris on December 7, 1849. The Prefecture of the Department of the Seine reports she expired at her domicile but does not specify the cause of death. Letters between her and her children talk about a lingering illness that she had been suffering from. It's safe to speculate that she probably succumbed to whatever this mysterious illness was. In the late 1930s, Eugene Bucks, who served as sexton to St. Louis Cemetery until 1924, discovered an old weathered and corroding copper plate in Alley 4 of the cemetery. The inscription on the plate read, Madame Lalaurie, née Marie Delphine McCarty, died in Paris, December 7th, 1842. Because the records show that she passed away in 1849, aged 62, the date on the plate found in the St. Louis Cemetery didn't have the incorrect date. The number 2 was so worn that it was misread. Her body was exhumed on January 7, 1851, to be sent back to New Orleans. She is now interred at the St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. The Lalaurie Mansion is considered by many to be New Orleans' most haunted house, and even rumored to be cursed. Subsequent owners have suffered death, insanity, and financial issues. Does Delphine still fiercely claim rightful ownership? Well, my dear friends, I hope you enjoyed that presentation. That was suggested by Amber Dawn, who indeed won the competition to suggest the video that I will be producing next. So congratulations, Amber. She wrote an email and told me that she received the other gifts, and I hope she enjoys them. And yeah, it's one of these videos where I just could never seem to get it finished. It's a bit like Leonardo da Vinci. Not that I'm putting myself anywhere in the same league as him, but we share the same annoying trait as perfectionists, where we just keep adding touches here, little finishing touch there, coming back to it. I'm finally glad it's over. It's done. So, what do you think about Delphine? It's interesting that in the early years, with her previous husbands, you never hear of the mistreatment of slaves, quite possibly because it wasn't recorded. She might have well been abusing the slaves. It's just interesting to look at it from different angles. Could it be that, a bit like the Moors murderers, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, that it took the two to come together, her and the last husband, the doctor, and then acted like a catalyst where the abuse started, the negative side come out, and then she started torturing these poor slaves? Or is it that the husband was doing this and she's taken the fall for him? Who knows? We'll never know the real truth. It just seems strange that they said she was always courteous to the coloured people she met in the streets, and that she had freed a few of her slaves. I just find that very unusual, but I'm looking forward to hearing your insights on this. So what did I find on the net about? I never knew really much about this case before it was suggested, so there was quite a few surprises for me, actually, as well. Yeah, so I found that it had quite a few uses after it was Madame Lalaurie's home, and over the decades it became sort of more seedy. At one time it functioned as an all-girls school where students often experienced bizarre and random physical assaults. Today, the Lalaurie mansion is still as stately as it is spooky and remains an iconic New Orleans landmark. Soon after the fire, the house was converted into an apartment complex and a tenant was murdered. However, the unusual nature of his death suggested ties to paranormal activity. These are things I've found on the internet, by the way, and this next page, it says about, a bit more. Let me find some bits so I could read out. At some stage, they broke it up into tenement apartments, mostly occupied by immigrant dock workers and their families. Their children immediately began to hear unexplained moans and groans, disembodied screams, burning human flesh. I don't know what that sounds like, so I don't know how they would know what that sounds like. Dragging of chains and scratching noises under the floorboards would bedevil the children's sleep. Their parents experienced none of these mysterious phenomena and wrote it off as simply their children's overactive imaginations. It's fairly common knowledge that children are much more attuned to the spirit world, perhaps because their minds are more open. Well, that is definitely, this part here is very true. This way, it appears on postcards of the city as early as the 1880s, labelled as the Haunted House of New Orleans. People spending the night in the home report waking up in the middle of the night to find a woman with long red hair glaring down at them as they slept. The same figure is reported by passers-by on the streets below, seeming to stare right through them as they walk by. Another thing I did read was that a lot of the stories, these lurid tales, in the decades following this event, became more and more outrageous. We'll get to that in a minute. And definitely, most of them are not true, the accounts. Yeah, so you often wonder how much of this is true. This is the modern mansion. You can read this, by the way. You can just pause it and read it. This notoriety makes the building something of a prized possession, but like the Hope Diamond, its beauty and majesty seem to exact a painful price. One owner after another comes to a bad end. Once opened a haunted pub, which he was forced to close a few years later. Shortly before this, he bequeathed the house to its last documented spirit. It's very strange. How do you do that? A suite upstairs was rented to a curious old man who died just days after moving in, and among his belongings was 10,000 in gold. His spirit still haunts the hallways of the mansion, seeking his misplaced fortune. I wonder who got the fortune. Owners through the decades found their health, sanity and wealth ruined by the touch of this accursed building. One owner ends his days in an asylum. Another slips into a coma after a bar fight. The most famous owner of all, Nicolas Cage, purchased the home just after Hurricane Katrina. A few years later, he lost the home in a bankruptcy that would strip him of all his possessions in New Orleans. We'll talk more about this in a minute. Yeah, so these stories that built up about her, saying that they drilled holes through the skulls. A lot of it's just rubbish, actually. And even the bit about the combing, the servant girl combing the hair. If you remember, I did the case of Elizabeth Bathory featured here. Very same situation, the girl combing the hair and hit a snag, etc. You wonder which person it's attributed to, really. But yeah, it sounds like another horrible woman in history. A lot of the tales I know that they said, I read, I can't find that page anymore, but they said there was a lot of authors in the 19th century, they wanted to capitalize on this story, and they just made outrageous claims to sell their books, and these claims have become history, So about Nicolas Cage, yeah, so he bought this mansion, and apparently he spent only one night in it because he could hear all sorts of ghostly sounds. And these sounds and disruptions scared him too much to stay a second night. The following night he rented a place across the street and let his friends have a party in the new mansion. I don't know how true this story is, since I don't know Nicolas Cage personally, the author of this blog writes. What is interesting to read, and you can find this yourself on the internet, it appears, if it's true, that Nicolas Cage thinks that he's been cursed since he bought this house, and that his fortunes have declined since he bought it. He hasn't really made any good movies since then, and the story goes he felt himself so cursed that he went to a psychic, and the psychic had said that he was cursed, and the only way to lift the curse was for him to build a grave in the same cemetery that Madame Lalaurie is buried. And the cemetery, of course, was no longer open for burials, so it took him a lot of money, apparently, to pay town officials to get himself a gravestone built, which is this thing here, this pyramid, which some suggest is Illuminati inspired. Yeah, that he paid, and a lot of residents are angry about that he was allowed to have this built in this historic cemetery. But that was the reason, apparently, because he wanted to try and lift the curse. How interesting is that, my dear viewers? Let me know what your thoughts on that, if you know any more about this, more than I do, because, as I say, the subject's quite new to me. Before I go, I've got some bloopers for you. One of them is quite lengthy. It was involving the word Havana in a sentence. And Havana, yeah, I can say it, but it got to a point that I was no longer sure how the word sounded. If you've ever done narration, you'll know what I'm talking about. It just got to a point, it was getting ridiculous. I just could not put that word in a sentence. It was all right separately, but trying to put it in a sentence, it just wouldn't work. You'll soon hear I was getting exasperated, I tell you. Also, during this, often I'm playing back. I'm listening to the narration to see whether there was any mistakes. I picked up something very, very faint, and I had to magnify it totally as far as I could. It was just a really faintest whisper. I'll include it. I have heard of spirit voices coming on to recordings, as happened in the Black Forest Hotel, where I had the camera and these voices picked up on the audio recording. Could be the same here. It says the word Eugene, who was the sexton of the New Orleans cemetery back then. So that's also at the end. I will say my goodbyes now. Thank you for being with me this time. Many more presentations to come. And yeah, take care. God bless. Enjoy the blooper. See you next time, my friends. Bye-bye. Named Marie Borgia Delphine Le... Named Marie Borgia Delphine Lopez L'Angelo de la Candelaria, nicknamed Borquita. No wonder they nicknamed her Borquita after all that. Jeez, breakfast would be over before you got that name out. On January the 11th, 1805, his vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of Havana. Off the shores of Havana. Off the shores of His vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of Havana. His vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of Havana. Nirvana. Smells like Teen Spirit. Oh, please let me get this out. On January the 11th, 1805, his vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of Havana. His vessel hit a... His vessel's... His blood vessel burst. His vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of Havana, and Raymond was killed. Raymond. His vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of Havana. On January the 11th, 1805, his vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of Havana. His vessel hit a sandbar. His vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of Havana. Oh, I don't believe it. His vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of Havana. His vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of Havana. I just can't put these words together. I can say them separately. His vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of Havana. His vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of... I got the giggles now. His vessel hit a sandbar off the shores of Havana, and Raymond was killed. My goodness, I finally got that out.